The greatest technician that's ever lived. Mold me into being the greatest technician that's ever lived. But it's nothing I can't fix, because I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. Well, it's a good thing they found me, since I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. And where does the greatest technician that's ever lived get his parts and computers from? My friends right down the street. Something greatest technician. Alright, for real this time. Ha, of course it works. How could you ever doubt the greatest technician that's ever lived? Help give me the self-proclaimed title of the greatest technician that's ever lived. Because I'm the greatest technician that's ever— Just kidding, it's still f***ed. Has a CPU that's slower than your Gam's Buick, a battery that lasts half as long as you do, and will literally burn down your house, and plastic that's as strong as your will to live. I'm just kidding, you're awesome and I love you. I'm very thankful for that job, because it helped mold me into the greatest technician that's ever lived. Upgrade laptops, and sell used business laptops instead. Because if the greatest technician that's ever lived can't repair it, I won't sell it. And I wonder how loud this can actually get. The greatest technician that's ever lived. And for the very first time in the life of the greatest technician that's ever lived. But because I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. So just appreciate what you have. Now let's take this box of depression back inside so we can see if that duct-taped SSD is as deep-fried as the greatest technician that's ever lived. Now, the only logical reason for this computer behaving is it must know it's in the presence of the greatest technician that's ever lived. Back in 1993, when I was a wee lad, my tiny raccoon-sized brain began associating learning with the computer, a trait that eventually molded me into the greatest technician that's ever lived. I'm just gonna hold on to this relic until the day I become the greatest technician that's ever died. Whoever did this hack job is far from being the greatest technician that's ever lived. Make sure I stop and read these directions. Just kidding. I don't need directions because I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. And who does my customer trust to do the job? Well, none other than the greatest technician that's ever lived. Moment of truth. The greatest technician that's ever lived. So if something does go wrong, you don't have to be the greatest technician that's ever lived to fix it. But have no fear, for the greatest technician that's ever lived is here. And hope that the greatest technician that's ever lived. I only sell business-grade laptops at my store because the greatest technician that's ever lived. And when the greatest technician that's ever lived. Because once word got out that the greatest technician that's ever lived, it's time to bring it back in to clean off the old thermal paste. And of course, since I'm I know exactly how much paste to use. This giant piece of speed is in my shop today because it's getting a new GPU. And not just any GPU, but the greatest GPU that's ever lived. Connecting it directly to the local power plant, it's time to test.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
But since I caught mesothelioma just looking at it, I need to take it outside and clean it before the greatest technician that's ever lived succumbs to black lung disease, which is great for keeping temps cool while gaming, but it also means it sucks harder than the greatest technician that's ever lived. But before I test that, I want to see the guts, and this device is no match for the greatest technician that's ever lived. So it happily sheds its goggles, and as soon as that screw is released, the cover pops up faster than you can lower your volume when I bass boost the greatest technician that's ever lived. Now it's been a long time since the greatest technician that's ever lived tripped balls. This visitor from planet Lint must have heard that
the greatest technician that's ever lived
was Earth-based, so they stopped in to cool down. And last but not least, the game that helped mold the greatest technician that's ever lived into a computer addict. Doom. Alright, let's plug in this doghouse and check those temps. The greatest technician that's ever lived. You just cleaned out your dusty case a few weeks ago after watching an offensive but informative video made by some weirdo that calls himself the greatest technician that's ever lived. So it's not like it overheated and oh no. I powered on and start my journey creating the greatest mini PC that's ever lived, which went smoothly without any issues whatsoever. And unless you make it look like balls. As for temps, the fan screams louder than your mother when the greatest technician that's ever lived makes a house call to defrag her hard drive. I never realized how much productivity I was losing by only having one screen until I hooked this bad boy up. Now I can be the greatest technician that's ever lived. But before little Timmy gets his hands on this 17-inch bazooka, they wanted the greatest technician that's ever lived to work my maintenance magic and get those temps back to normal. To self-revive, I continued unscrewing the Phillips screws holding the bottom panel, and it looks like this one has a warranty sticker. We all know that doesn't mean anything to me because I'm so of course I unscrew it. Now that I'm free from prison, I can Vegas heat. Together with these chargers by my side, it'll be no problem for the greatest to achieve world domination. This customer sent in their laptop using the link in my bio because 2 other shops told him it was f***ed and he wanted the opinion of the greatest technician that's ever lived. And the first thing I notice is the keyboard being more cracked out than the guy I met behind Circus Circus. I have a wife, but $20 is $20. And just like the greatest technician that's ever lived. These drives were born slow, but unfortunately even the greatest technician that's ever lived couldn't get it to power on, but it is EPA approved. Well, I grew up poor as fuck, and we did whatever we could to keep things running by fixing them, usually with duct tape. And even though this helped mold me into the greatest technician that's ever lived, and just like the father of the greatest technician that's ever lived, this 4-port charger came at just the right time. So of course this job is no match for the greatest technician that's ever lived. I just have to unscrew the bottom case and pop it open to, well, my inability to spot signs of motherboard damage is what makes me the greatest technician that's ever lived. But what's crazy is everything works perfectly fine. But of course, being the greatest technician that's ever lived, it's no problem for me. Oh god. So let's start by putting the iPad down face first on a hot surface, just like the greatest technician that's ever lived was after leaving a bar in Vegas. This is what years of binging anime looks like. Something the greatest. Anyways, since the greatest technician that's ever lived has repaired these more times than your therapist has repaired your broken heart, crashing and unstable. 2 things the greatest technician that's ever lived knows all about.
It's upside down.
The greatest technician that's ever lived. 6 bottles of lube to charge 3 devices at once, which is a must when you're the greatest technician that's ever lived. And in the deranged world of the greatest technician that's ever lived, just as easy as convincing you that I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. So I'll have to send it in to somebody who's actually the greatest technician that's ever lived. Although my brain holds as much info as this fake hard drive, I do possess the skills of
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
Ah, finally. Reassemble everything and the greatest technician that's ever lived. She also knew how to make a mighty good roast, a quality that was passed down to this beast has a 13th Gen i9, and just like the greatest technician that's ever lived, it packs a lot of heat. Poetry in all its glory because only enjoys the finest things in life. Neither pubes nor dust, nor skeet nor hair shall keep the greatest technician that's ever lived from doing repair. The dust balls that have been living here rent-free, just like the greatest technician that's ever lived, resides rent-free in your head. So easy, anyone with half a working brain can do. Just plug it in, boot it up, and
The greatest technician.
now you don't have to be the greatest technician that's ever lived to do this. Please, laptop manufacturers, for the love of the greatest technician that's ever lived, stop using plastic hinge mounts. What's that noise? The greatest technician that's ever lived. Because no toothbrush in the universe is safe from the greatest technician that's ever lived. The greatest headset that's ever lived. By opening up Steam and logging into the greatest technician that's ever lived. So we can play Pal World, also known as the greatest Pokemon game that was never made. Even while being violated by the pube mammoth from Goochville, they said, you buy something new. Thankfully, repair shops like mine still exist, so the greatest technician that's ever lived is more than happy to take on the job. And for all you size queens that want more storage, you don't need to be
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
to fill this empty slot. Now you don't have to be
The greatest technician that's
ever lived to know it's bad for a graphics card to do the Carolina Squadron, but we still need tools to do the actual cleaning, and being
the greatest technician that's ever lived.
means always packing the best tools. Always give it a deep cleaning and some new thermal paste, because
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
only sells the greatest laptops ever made. Following the doctor's directions your mother wishes she ignored, and the greatest technician. Thankfully, you don't need the tiny raccoon-like fingers of the
Greatest technician that's ever lived.
to resolve your laptop's intimacy issues. Ah, an unsuspecting stranger. Don't mind if I do. Now that I have my new tools to match my new shirt, it's time to transform into the greatest technician that's ever lived. And given my current rate of mental decay, this may even outlast the greatest technician that's ever lived. It's that I should use protection if I poke my tool into a dirty hole. So with the snap of a finger, I transform from the greatest technician that's ever lived into the Gooch Collector. It can be plugged into my incredibly high-tech cloning station that, for some reason, isn't powering on. The greatest technician that's ever lived. I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived.